Mir was murdered. Orion was murdered. Sue was murdered. Rigel was murdered. Gianna was murdered. Ursa Major was murdered. Beetlejuice was murdered. Vela was murdered. Tommy Innit was murdered. Almalim was murdered. Mila was murdered. Mario was murdered. Ava was murdered. Aldebaran was murdered. Mintika was murdered. Wezin was murdered. Alfaritz was murdered. Graphius was murdered. Gacentori was murdered. Phoenix was murdered. Canopus was murdered. Minkalanen was murdered. Avery was murdered. Alfard was murdered. Origa was murdered. Alhina was murdered. Ellie was murdered.
No! God, please, no! No! No!
Subroarbus was murdered. Was murdered. Alfard, Graphius, Phoenix, Ursa Major, Ava, Vela, Aldebaran, Eridanus, Becrix, Alference, Minkalanen, Canopus, Wezin, Shedder, Tommy Innit, Orion, Sepnap, Subroarbus, Mila, Alnilam, Mintika, Gianna, Mario, Ellie, Mia, Avery, Ethan, Beetlejuice, Gacentori, Rigel, Luna, Alhina, Origa, Markebar respawning. Gruz was murdered. Bellatrix was murdered. Safe was murdered. Ophiuchus was murdered. Canopus was murdered. Subroarbus was murdered. Shioki was murdered.
Dan TDM was murdered. Riley was murdered. Taurus was murdered. Sapnap was murdered. Aldebaran was murdered. Arcturus was murdered. Gianna was murdered. Ava was murdered. Alfaritz was murdered. Ellie was murdered. Ursa Major was murdered. Benjamin was murdered. Ethan was murdered. Harper was murdered. Orion was murdered. Technoblade was murdered. Deneb was murdered. Wezin was murdered. Leo was murdered. Naos was murdered. Hamal was murdered. Merzum was murdered. Akrox was murdered.
Phoenix was murdered. Decentori was murdered. Puppis was murdered. Subroarbus, Ava, Merzum, Bellatrix, Canopus, Arcturus, Ophiuchus, Ursa Major, Riley, Grus, Ellie, Taurus, Wezin, Naos, Alference, Aldebaran, Dan TDM, Curry Crusader, Orion, Acrox, Phoenix, Puppis, Hamal, Benjamin, Gianna, Shioki, Decentori, Harper, Ethan, Technoblade, Safe, Leo, Denebar respawning. Liam was murdered. Mila was murdered. Gemini was murdered. Crux was murdered. Tommy Innit was murdered. Origa was murdered. Draco was murdered. Procyon was murdered. Mia was murdered. Noah was murdered. Graphius was murdered. Subroarbus was murdered. Capella was murdered. Elnath was murdered. Canopus was murdered. Subroarbus, Mia, Asher, Liam, Noah, Tommy Innit, Procyon, Mintika, Graphius, Avery, Mila, Draco, Vega, Cassiopeia, Sagittarius, Cetus, Elnath, Scorpius.
Que no me da tiempo ni a saludar. ¿Qué mierda eso?
Canopus, Merzum, Capella, Crocs, Enif, Gemini, Origar respawning. Curry Crusader was murdered. Difter was murdered. Subroarbus was murdered. Vela was murdered. Becrix was murdered.
Illumina was murdered. Rasselhogwi was murdered. Technoblade was murdered. Gacentori was murdered. Aljiba was murdered. Sabak was murdered. Naos was murdered. Ava was murdered. Mateo was murdered. Subroarbus is boosting the time. Isabella was murdered. Ellie was murdered. Eridamus was murdered. Dan TDM was murdered. Alhina was murdered. Liam was murdered. Mia was murdered. Wezin was murdered. Scarlet was murdered. Regulus was murdered. Scorpius was murdered. Pisces Ostrinus was murdered. Puppis was murdered. Zosma was murdered. Logan was murdered. Markab was murdered. Purpled was murdered. Procyon was murdered. Silver Orbis, Dan TDM, Illumina, Ellie, Ava, Mia, Technoblade, Purpled, Isabella, Scarlet, Merzum, Wezen, Eridanos, Logan, Rassel Hogwi, Lyra, Markab, Draco, Luna, Puppis, Alnilam, Vela, Pisces Australis, Zosma, Curry Crusader, Scorpius, Regulus, Algiba, Liam, Sabic, Gacentori, Procyon, Becrix, Naos, Altair, Gacrix, Denevela, Alhina, Mateo, Leo, Markeb are respawning. Virgo was murdered. Evelyn was murdered. Orion was murdered. Cassiopeia was murdered. Phoenix was murdered. Han was murdered. Mir was murdered. Lyra was murdered. Deneb was murdered. Pisces Australis was murdered. Hamal was murdered. James was murdered. Achernar was murdered. Eridanos was murdered. Canopus was murdered. Arya was murdered. Aiden was murdered. Isabella was murdered. Silver Orbis is boosting the time. Regulus was murdered. Ellie was murdered. Markab was murdered. Purpled was murdered. Mateo was murdered. Gacentori was murdered. Procyon was murdered. Restored the power. Algiba was murdered. Alnilam was murdered. Aquila was murdered. Rassel Hogwi was murdered. Leon was murdered. Leo was murdered. Avery was murdered. Markeb was murdered. Sophia was murdered. Draco was murdered.
Capella was murdered. Crux was murdered. Alhina was murdered. Aldebaran was murdered. Vela was murdered. Wezen was murdered. Sophia, Evelyn, Ellie, Layla, Avery, Arya, Isabella, Leo, Rassel Hogwi, James, Liam, Naos, Markab, Hamal, Markeb, Mia, Algiba, Regulus, Vela, Lyra, Gacrix, Origa, Draco, Achernar, Gacentori, Tures, Crux, Han, Eridanos, Canopus, Merzum, Alnilam, Wezen, Aiden, Capella, Pisces Australis, Phoenix, Orion, Cassiopeia, Aquila, Procyon, Logan, Aldebaran, Virgo, Purpled, Alhina, Mateo, Deneb, Scarlet are respawning. Beetlejuice was murdered. Sagittarius was murdered. Dan TDM was murdered. Altair was murdered. Decentori was murdered.
Excluding villagers. Alphard, Gacrix, Scorpius, Acentori, Costralis, Maya Placidus, Ursa Minor, Spica, Mizar, Aiden, Arcturus, Peter, Jack, Zosma, Ophiuchus, Andromeda, Izar, Ursa Major, Menkant, Pollux, Altair, Vela, Shedder, Zulu, Sargus, Atticus, Canis Minor, Avery, Rassel Hogwi, Zecentori, Leroag, Gruss, Myrak, Ethan, Nova, Mirak, Cephus, Alioth, Juba, Mendika, Sabic, Ava, Elijah, Oliver, Wyatt, Harper, Ella, Arya, Lilipuchu, Alexis, Dan TDM, Luigi, Tommy Innit, Sapnap, Thinknoodles, Lepus, Phoenix, Lupus, Corvus, Merfak, Alcade, Antares, Algal, Bo Odis, Wezen, Beetlejuice, Centaurus, Gemini, Isabella, Benjamin, Markab, Enif, Aaron, Hydra, Virgo, Canis Major, Puppis, Carter, Bellatrix, Regulus, Aries, Logan, Aquila, Aladra, Elnath, Capella, Charlotte, Pavo, Karina, Minkalanen, Cygnus, Avier, Pegasus, Perseus, Leo, Suhel, Denevela, Taurus, Markeb, Lucas, Asher, Henry, Daniel, William, Layla, Polly, Cupquake, Nicholas were excluded. Jackson, Elizabeth, Noah, Gacentori, Han, Eridanos, Sarah, Dream, Orion, Acrox, Canopus, Cassiopeia, Nunki, Atria, Fomalhaut, Deneb, Castor, Adara, Almedak, Alhina, Epsini, Pisces Australis, Lirio, Lily, Rigel, Sagittarius, Draco, Guest, Villager, Grayson, Alupi, Gina, Rieger, Devilorum, Mia, Naos, Sick, Becrix, Zola, Alderaman, Difta, Shala, Michael, Lisa, Sophia, Triangulum Australe, Anka, Thecta, Lyra, Almach, Alner, Alnilam, Peacock, Emma, Sheet, Alference, Oreologist, Graphius, Lucky, Mason, Chroma, Luna, Eltonin, Gianna, Riley, John, Illumina, Nebula, Mario, Bad Boy Halo, Ethabet, Estrant, Arneb, Estrella, Camilla, Evelyn, Crux were excluded. New game mode. Murderer mode. Starting in 10 seconds. Several orbs are respawning. Merzum was murdered. Decentori was murdered. Jamma was murdered. George not found was murdered. Aldebaran was murdered. Sebastian was murdered. Hamal was murdered. Procyon was murdered. Purpled was murdered. Levi was murdered. Mateo was murdered. Eastix was murdered. Sheva was murdered. Epcentori was murdered. Mankar was murdered. Decrix was murdered.
Tyrese was murdered. Origa was murdered. Sirius was murdered. Aljiba was murdered. Espure 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 was murdered. Game mode ending soon.
Game mode ending in 10 seconds. Several orbs survived. Mimosa, Kaf, Kachab, Aljiba, Technoblade, Malachi, Mila, Liam, Aurora, Olivia, Lightning, James, Cascorpii survived. Mia, Layla, Lilipuchu, Mateo, Riley, Logan, Scarlett, Leo, Nebula, Lucas, Daniel, Aurora, Anka, Atticus, Peter, Alexis, Michael, Aaron, Corpse CATTT, Emma, Amelia, Cupquake, Merzum, Wezen, Mintika, Shala, Gakrix, Castor, Alner, Aljiba, Duba, Mirek, Alfard, Enif, Almach, Graphius, Canis Major, Centaurus, Triangulum Australe, Sagittarius, Puppis, Corvus, Aviar, Hadar, Vega, Capella, Beetlejuice, Alnidak, Laraag, Aldebaran, Cascorpii, Satyr, Suhel, Markeb, Zecentauri, Orion, Lyra, Virgo, Ursa Minor, Phoenix, Ophiuchus, Lirio, Alpheratz, Decentauri, Crocs, Bellatrix, Kachab, Oliver, Mason, Charlotte, Ellie, Malachi, Technoblade, Thinknoodles, Purpled, Tommy Innit, Maya Placidus, Minkalanen, Rieger, Alcade, Merfak, Sick, Mankar, Myrak, Gacentori, Karina, Polly, Arcturus, Alioth, Shioki, Devalorum, Algal, Nunki, Atria, Markab, Sheet, Sabak, Gemini, Aquila, Scorpius, Pisces Australis, Cygnus, Ursa Major, Lupus were excluded. Jackson, Pollux, Pavo, Menkant, Polaris, Wyatt, Isabella, Henry, Mimosa, Luna, Lily, Benjamin, Noah, Ethan, John, Grayson, Asher, Aria, Harper.
15 seconds remaining. Ten seconds remaining. Five minutes of seeking time started. Good luck.
Subroarbus survived. Mizar, Perseus, Zulu, Rasalhagui, Gianna, Luigi, Asuntori, Thecta, Sargus, Elijah, Aiden, Sapnap survived.